Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to TradeWinds, our bi-weekly virtual event series where we discuss the future of global trade in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. TradeWinds episodes normally run on the first and third Wednesday of each month. And we are very grateful to have a large and diverse audience spanning now over 63 countries across the world. My goal is to reach participants in all 164 WTO members. I would like to highlight today our viewers from Africa, which so far have come from 10 countries. Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Madagascar, Morocco, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. In this, our sixth episode of TradeWinds, we will explore the topic, African perspectives on the WTO and prospects for regional trade integration, a theme that highlights the increasing role of the continent in the global trade landscape. To lead our conversation today, I am very honored to have with us two great speakers. Let me first introduce Dr. Vera Songwe, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Among her long-standing track record of delivering on development, Vera is a strong advocate of global and regional African trade integration and a promoter of innovation and digital trade for growth and jobs in the region. And I can attest from my days at the World Bank, where we were colleagues, that Vera is a great trade expert. Vera is joined by Dr. Robert Lawrence, a distinguished professor of international trade and investment at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's also, among many other things, my colleague, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And one of the many things that I learned from Robert a long time ago, aside from the ins and outs of globalization, is that he is originally from South Africa. So welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for being here with us at TradeWinds. I will turn it over to Vera and Robert in a moment. For you in the audience, please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the platform, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So at a time when major countries are erecting barriers and disentangling from the global economy, Africa is coming together to deepen trade cooperation and support a rules-based trading system. To start with, countries are putting in place the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, the CFTA, which, when concluded and successfully implemented, would become the largest free trade area in the world in terms of membership, connecting 1.3 billion people across 55 countries with a combined GDP valued at $3.4 trillion. The CFTA aims at liberalizing trade and facilitating the movement of goods and services in the region. It would also provide certainty to businesses, allowing investors to leverage growing consumer markets and to integrate into regional and global value chains. Benefits would also accrue to consumers and to domestic producers. A recent World Bank study by Maluseska and Ruta finds that if implemented fully, the CFTA could boost regional income by 7%, or $450 billion, speed up wage growth for women, and lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty by 2035. The key word here is implementation, and particularly cutting red tape and simplifying customs procedures. This is particularly important in the context of the pandemic. The region is expected to suffer its first recession in 25 years. Unilateral measures to protect against the virus, including border closings and others, are significantly disrupting African trade. And the virus has also impacted the CFTA negotiating calendar, in particular the start trading date, which was moved from July this year to January next year. But regional value chains could also help fight the pandemic, and the CFTA could support economic recovery and pave the way for renewed growth. Now, Africa is also showing a renewed commitment to engage and support the rules-based trading system. Moreover, three African candidates have offered their trajectory and expertise to lead the WTO in these challenging times. So, African countries have long been mostly excluded from the benefits of international trade. Through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and an African imprint on global trade governance, they seem determined to change that. And one of my favorite quotes from the region is from Rwanda's President Paul Kagame, who during the signature of the CFTA said, "The promise of free trade and free movement is prosperity for all Africans." I think the rest of the world could take note. So let me now turn to Vera and Robert and ask them, is there a new African voice emerging on trade cooperation? If so, what do you think are the main trade messages coming out of Africa? And why is it that trade cooperation is so relevant for African countries? So let me first start with you, Vera. And again, welcome to TradeWinds.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Anabel. Thanks for having me. And hello to you, Robert. Good to have you with us on this conversation as well. And to all the participants that are listening, hello, and hope you're keeping safe. Listen, is there a new trade voice on the continent? I think the answer is yes. There has always been a trade voice on the continent. My sense is not so much that it is new as it is that it is solidifying. And I think that there is a resoluteness in the work that is being done and that has been done over the last 3 years to make sure that Africa gets to implementation, as you said, of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. I mean, you have already given a lot of the strong points of the African Continental Free Trade Area, one of them being jobs. As you know, as a continent, we need to create at least 13 million jobs a year just to ensure that we can absorb the youth that are coming into the African market. And so we believe that the African Continental Free Trade Area is one of the ways in which we can do that. The second thing I think that we must talk about when we talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area is really the accompanying architecture that we're putting around it. One, around investment, and secondly, around ensuring that we get the right kind of infrastructure that takes us there. And, you know, you're in the United States. I think when we look back a little bit at, you know, what NAFTA did, and now, you know, the renewed US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, one of the big conversations that happened around that was about the sort of over 175,000 jobs that will be created. But more importantly, I think two of the strengths of this new US, Mexico, Canada agreement was the inclusion of this whole digital conversation in trade agreements. Prior to that, we didn't really have a lot of discussion on e-commerce, e-trade. And as we talk about the fourth industrial revolution and how Africa is going to embrace that, we must begin to talk about technology. And I think one of the things that the CFTA is also doing now is we've added technology to part of that conversation around the AfCFTA to see how we can, as Africa, stand up our ICT sector and ensure that we can also benefit from that development. Intellectual property rights, another big issue that, you know, the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement was looking at, is something that we're looking at very, very closely. And even more so now in the context of COVID, where we need to begin to look at pharmaceutical products, we need to look at IPs around medicinal herbs and how we can then ensure that Africa can get into those markets in a way that is sustainable and profitable. The last thing that I want to say about the AfCFTA is the whole concept of developing regional value chains. I think this is very powerful, and I use the US-Mexico-Canada agreement deliberately because I want to talk about this regional value chains that are developing on that corridor. In the East, when we go East, we see regional value chains that also develop before goods are eventually exported. And I think that's what the continent wants to do. We haven't done very well since Africa joined the WTO in terms of increasing our overall exports out of the continent. We're still at about 2%. We could do a lot more, but the only way we could do that is if we begin to do more value addition on the continent. I think today, as we discuss the AfCFTA, The Economic Commission for Africa is working with many countries to do what we're calling national competitiveness strategies and then regional competitiveness strategies to understand how we can ensure that there is value addition within regions, within the continent before we export the final good, because that's the only way where we can add more value, create more jobs, and ensure that this agreement is a successful one for the continent. So yes, there is a renewed and reinvigorated approach to trade. We believe that we can only grow through trade, but we need to do it in an orderly and, as you said very well, with a lot more certainty for the private sector that we would like to attract from outside the continent to join us in this journey.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vera, for those insightful comments. Let me now turn it over to you, Robert, to hear your views.
Yes, well, I think firstly, as has already been mentioned, the fact that African countries are renewing their commitment to a global trading system based on rules is really significant. Africa does represent the future. If you look at population growth and projections, even for GDP growth, and Africa is going to become increasingly important in the global economy. And the fact that there is this overt action on the part of the leadership in Africa is highly significant. You know, during the global financial crisis, almost every leader in the world proclaimed their belief in open trade. During this recent crisis, those proclamations are conspicuous by their absence. So I think this is a very, very important contribution that the African leaders are making. At the same time, though, there is also a recognition that trade is not only good for the world, but regional trade is extremely important for Africa. There's a kind of conventional wisdom that since African countries often specialize in exactly the same products as their neighbors, there isn't a lot of scope for regional trade within Africa. But I think that's totally false, because it ignores the fact that there are really two types of trade. There's trade based on differences, traditional comparative advantage trade, and yes, that kind of trade is definitely the kind where Africans may specialize in similar products. But there's a second kind of trade, which we see flourishing in regions. And that's often trade between countries, intra-industry, selling similar products. After all, if you know how to sell in Tanzania, you're probably going to understand much more easily how to go and sell in Kenya. So potentially, there's a tremendous amount of intra-regional trade that ought to be taking place, and especially important for smaller firms. It's very difficult to launch a global strategy. It's much more practical to talk about selling across one border or two borders. And it is the small traders, relatively speaking, a lot of whom are women in Africa, that stand to gain the most from deep regional integration within Africa. And yet, if we look at the data, we see that Africa is far from exploiting its full potential. The intra-regional trade numbers are really much, much smaller than we see elsewhere. So I do think an emphasis on regional integration is very important for Africa itself. I also think, though, that when we look at this grand design, it's part of the answer. But I think the top-down approach has to be accompanied by a bottom-up approach. You know, there are different narratives about why Europe succeeded. And it wasn't because when they started, they got 27 or 28 countries all in a room and they decided what to do. The way I see Europe's evolution It started with just 3, the Benelux. It expanded to 6. And then there was a cumulative process. As groups of willing countries proved that they could succeed with integration, others were attracted into this vortex, and increasingly the whole European continent became much closer to a single market. Now, I think Africa also needs, and it's clear in the design of the free trade agreement for Africa, that these other kinds of agreements, which are more localized, whether it's the SACU or the South African Customs Union, or whether it's the East African Customs Union or WEMU, that these have to become building blocks for an ultimately integrated Africa. Because bottom-up, I think, has also a crucial role to play in all of this. And what is dangerous about this agreement, and I think we have to acknowledge this, is that the leaders build up expectations that Africa is going to become integrated, but the people on the ground don't actually see the true benefits. And so, as you were talking about earlier, Anabel, and I'll close on this, it's necessary to make sure that it's fine to lower tariffs. Of course, those are an essential ingredient in increasing international integration. But it's also got to be the case that the customs have to work properly. And there's both inefficiency and there's corruption. And these have to be fought in order to integrate. It's kind of, not having an efficient customs is kind of like strangling yourself around your neck. You know, that is the lifeblood of every country. And so I think this has to be prioritized. And then there's infrastructure. Africa's infrastructure challenges are tremendous. And Vera has spoken about e-commerce. E-commerce does offer the opportunity. People see threats from the fourth industrial revolution in the form of robots and displacing labor-intensive activities. But I think they also need to recognize that the fourth industrial revolution offers us the opportunity to skip over a lot of the obstacles to intra-country trade. And so e-commerce has to be an essential ingredient. Now, there are some types of e-commerce where you can deliver services at much lower cost. And so it's in the services area that, in a sense, this particular technology can be exploited. But ultimately, if you want to use e-commerce, you ultimately have to deliver the goods. And to deliver the goods that have been ordered through e-commerce, you again have to concentrate on improving the infrastructure. And indeed, I would say the security of delivery, which is kind of taken for granted often in developed countries, but is a serious issue within an African context. So I think there's lots of work to be done, both top down and bottom up. But I think ultimately this offers an opportunity to enhance the development of Africa so that it can play its appropriate role in the global economy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert, for your comments. And I think it is interesting in this recent study from the World Bank that I've mentioned, and I know that UN Economic Commission for Africa and also the African Development Bank have all highlighted the important role of trade facilitation in the region, because we know that borders are thick. And if the benefits are going to reach domestic producers, consumers, the region needs to work on cutting the red tape, improving customs procedures. Actually, I think that study talked about that, out of the 450 billion in benefits that are expected, to almost 292 billion would come from cutting red tape and improving trade facilitation. So this is clearly a critical issue. And I would come to this. I also want to come to several of the points that you mentioned on e-commerce and others. But before going deeper into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, I'd like to ask both of you one question on the WTO. because we know that the system is under stress and that most WTO members agree that the system needs to be reformed to tackle both old and new challenges. And I'd like to hear from you. How do you think Africa countries view WTO reform, and how could it contribute to global trade cooperation? And here in particular, I'd be interested in your views on which topics are particularly relevant from the African perspective in the global trading system, and also whether some African countries at least, and I believe that to be the case, but whether some African countries are ready to take an active role in negotiations as important, for instance, as those in the area of digital trade. Vera, let me turn it over to you now and hear your views on this.
Thank you again. I think, no, this is an important point. Listen, the biggest benefit of WTO, and we have all spoken about it, is about creating predictability, consistency, and stability in the regulation of global trade. And I think this we need. From simple border crossings on the continent to continental border crossings, and how you ship goods, and standardization and harmonization. So I think, you know, we need an institution that regulates, harmonizes, and ensures stability of that process, especially since I think most of us still believe that trade is one of the fastest ways out of poverty and one of the fastest ways to increase incomes. Now, having said that, what are some of the important issues for the continent? We still have a lot from the Doha development round, a lot of conversations that were not finished that need to at least be clarified and finalized. Some of them, of course, are, you know, the forever recurring issues, which are not only happening at the global level, but are also happening at the sub-regional levels of agriculture. I mentioned the move from NAFTA to USMCA. A big part of it was all around, you know, US farmers and Canadian milk and dairy farmers. We also have the same issues on the continent. We need to ensure and guarantee that our agriculture produce can reach the rest of the world in a manner that is equitable and that there is a level playing field, which we still do not believe we have enough of. Cotton is a big issue. Over 30 countries on the continent today, particular small business women make their revenues from fishing. And we believe that the whole conversation around fisheries subsidies is still not where it has to be. Africa does not get the benefit of its whole sort of, you know, life in the ocean, neither by way of protection or by way of pricing. And I think we need to bring those conversations back. But then going further, of course, as we begin to talk about sort of what is in the new trade development conversations, we have just spoken about e-commerce. We've spoken about the fact that we need to improve on the logistics systems. There's a whole big discussion, of course, on standards and safety. And I think that that's another area where, you know, the global trading system is moving, which may or may not disadvantage the continent if we are not clear on quality and standards, because the competition will move away from just discussions on goods and services, but around questions of standardization and health, phytosanitary issues that need to be taken into account. And as was being said, it's not just about tariffs, it's about all the non-tariff barriers that are being put up for African goods to penetrate into the global trading system. So we need WTO for that. I think the good thing and the benefit of the AfCFTA is that Africa can leverage its collective voice. Today we have 44 of the over 50 countries on the continent are WTO members. We have another 9 that are, and actually the Economic Commission for Africa is working with Ethiopia and Sudan that are now in the process of accessing the WTO, in the hope that the more we have, and I mean, Ethiopia and Sudan are pretty big countries on the continent, so their voices and their contribution to this debate will be particularly important for us as we go forward, looking at what we need to do. I think Robert was very right about the sort of small and medium enterprises and what we need to do with them. A part of this negotiation is also going to be about how we ensure that there are benefits around new trading rules that guarantee that SMEs and MSMEs can actually have access to better trading arrangements and better trading infrastructure. So I think the Africa Working Group is much stronger and will benefit, the Africa Working Group of the WTO will be much stronger and benefit from all the work that we have done over the last decade or more on getting to the AfCFTA, because I think within the continent, we have been able to argue, debate, disagree around how we wanted to end up on the AfCFTA. Now that we are there, we have a collective voice that we can take to the WTO, informed by our own constraints, informed by our own advantages, to ensure that, you know, for once when these discussions are happening, we can actually contribute positively, not just for Africa, but hopefully for the rest of the developing world and the developed world in some cases that may not have confronted some of the issues that we are confronting. So to summarize, we do need a WTO that is functional, that can provide this level playing field. Africa still has some old issues that we need to put on the table: agriculture, fisheries, that we need to discuss. Cotton, we still have our whole Sahel region, which needs to grow, which needs to, is one of the regions on the continent that still sees GDP per capita very low. We need to look at how we do that and how we do it better. Of course, e-commerce, as we go ahead and begin to have those conversations on e-commerce. I think Africa actually will probably be one of the groups that will come to the e-commerce discussions very strong, because the African Union has just put together a strategy for e-commerce on the continent. So we are coming there now with actually a blueprint and a document that we can use to have those conversations in a way that is more informed and that will add value to the global conversation. So my sense is let's see where we go with that, and hopefully that Africa's contributions will be valuable.
Thank you. Thank you for those excellent remarks, Vera. So a very important global trade agenda for Africa. And I think a very interesting point that we, you know, one of the, I would say probably benefits of having a more fragmented world, which is challenging in itself, but one of the benefits is that other voices can come through more clearly, more loudly. And in this case, through the exercise of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, a collective, stronger voice in the WTO would certainly be very beneficial, in my view, for the global trading system. So, Robert, what do you think about these issues of Africa in the WTO?
Well, I agree with Vera that Africa speaking with one voice, or identifying its common interests, is very important. But I would urge Africa to think further than that. There is a huge structural problem in the WTO itself. And that has to do with the fact that countries are able to self-identify as whether or not they are developing countries. And what we have are some of the most significant economies in the world. China, India, other BRICS, who, in a sense, want to be classified and benefit from rules as developing countries. And on the other side, we have the advanced countries who look at this and say, these are serious competitors for us. And we can't have a system in which we are expected to give them special and differential treatment. Now, it's interesting because in the climate area, there was a very similar problem. Basically, the large countries who were the large emitters happened to be large developing countries. And originally, they didn't take on obligations in climate. It was supposed to be the so-called Annex I countries that took on all the obligations. Somehow they got past that, in fact, in Paris, and they came up with a formula of common goals but differentiated approaches. And in some ways, that's what we need at the WTO. We need more differentiation among the countries. We cannot have a system of rules which will grant the same kind of privileges to very small African countries at the same time as it grants exactly the same kind of privileges to very large countries like China, who are classified as developing countries. this is an area where I think, rather than confront the whole issue of classification of whether or not you're a developed or developing country, what we need to have is more differentiation among the obligations that different countries are taking on in different agreements. I think, as Anabel, you pointed out, as was the case in the trade facilitation agreement, what we need is to advance. We could have plurilateral agreements among some of those more advanced countries, and indeed large developing countries who are ready to take on obligations within the WTO. But then again, we can have other countries who are not yet ready. And so what we need is a more subtle and differentiated system at the WTO that can allow not only for groupings, all of whom take the same position, but differentiation among countries, so that we can, in fact, grant those who are genuinely poor, those who are genuinely needy, the special treatment which they ought to be given, while not at the same time being obliged to grant similar treatment to very large and viable countries, and thereby basically implode the negotiations. So I think Africa needs to think imaginatively in its common position, in thinking about how we can induce more differentiation, emulate what happened in climate, where we got countries each making their best offers, with the one addition that we make these obligations legally binding. So that would be just one provocative idea, which I would put on the table for thinking about a common African position.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. This is a topic that, of course, we know it's very important in the context of the WTO. It's important for Africa. It also presents Africa. But with this comment, I actually want to now come into the AfCFTA, because in the context of the Continental Free Trade Area, there is some differentiation that is made for lesser developed countries in the context of the tariff negotiations. And I think this is a bit like putting into practice what you were just mentioning, Robert, in terms of greater differentiation. So going into the CFTA, and we will come to our audience very soon after this question, because we have a very active audience today with a number of very interesting questions. So I'd like to ask Vera, what next for the CFTA? We know that negotiators are working on finalizing the tariff schedules, the rules of origin, the specific commitments on services, to fully sort of conclude the first stage of the CFTA, so that traders can actually start trading under the CFTA by early next year, and that there's then a second phase of negotiations. But maybe we can hear directly from you as to what next in the CFTA negotiations.
So first of all, of course, with COVID, we have there's been a blow a little bit to the conversations and the discussions, but I'm happy to say that just last week we started again the technical discussions around relaunching the CFTA. A decision, I think, has almost already been made by our leaders that the official launch now of the CFTA will happen at the beginning of next year, so in January 2021. So I think that has created new momentum around the conversations. We're now finalizing the conversations around the rules of origins, which has been a big issue to finalize and have agreement on by everybody. And I just wanted to come to Robert's point on the sort of bottom-up versus top-down conversation. Actually, in my view, Robert, the CFTA has been a lot more bottom-up than it has been top-down, because if you look at it, we come to the CFTA after having said that Africa has at least 15 different sort of trade agglomerations, and the whole idea was to say, and we used to call it the spaghetti bowl of trade agreements on the continent. But what that actually did is that, today, as we write and discuss the CFTA, we are benefiting from payment systems and the experience of the SADC or the Southern African region. We are benefiting from border controls and the opening up from the East African community. We are benefiting from ECOWAS and all the work that has been done around, single passports and single trading agreements. So there is a lot that has already happened at each of these regional economic communities level. And the CFTA is just now bringing them together. The big challenge that we have is to really begin to see how two independent regional economic communities will start trading to really test the CFTA. You're right, it's not easy. Africa has over 100 borders amongst ourselves. So we are not talking about US, Mexico, Canada, we're talking about 109 borders. Border controls, how we're going to work on that is going to be particularly important. And I think that this work still needs to be done. But there is a lot of work that has happened already at the regional economic communities level that we're just building up upon and seeing how we go forward with that. This, Anabel, goes to you to answer your question. There is what we call the Boosting Inter-Africa Trade Action Plan that we have put together that essentially goes to some of the issues that you've raised and that Robert has raised in terms of the implementation framework. How we ensure that we actually work on border controls and border processes and get single border agreements, and maybe even with the use of electronics and technology, that you don't even have those controls at the borders, you could do them at origin and at destination. So I think there is a lot of work there that is being done under the Boosting Intra-Africa Trade piece. The next stages of the CFTA conversation, and we're lobbying really hard that we should bring forward the discussion on e-commerce, but we are going to be looking at issues of intellectual property right, issues of competition policy. I think we are all seeing in the global space how important the combination of intellectual property rights, e-commerce, and competition policy are. Of course, Africa has spoken a lot about the whole issue of industrialization. What does it mean? How can we do it? How should we do it? How do we create those regional value chains? So those are some of the big steps that we're going to be doing post January. Once we would finalize the two big things for January, between now and January, are rules of origin, ensuring that we have common agreement around them, ensuring that we have clarity around those, because of course, Africa wants to open its markets, we want to do the CFTA, but we don't want the external market to come in an unlawful way and encroach on our markets. Otherwise, we will lose all the benefits of the CFTA, particularly because we're looking at benefiting the small and medium-sized companies on the continent. So I think this is the really important part. The second one is, of course, the country's offers. What is going to be in the list of products that we start trading on? I want to say that one thing that it has done for us, which almost already begins to show that the CFTA is working, is with COVID, we've been able to bring together medium-sized pharmaceutical producers on the continent. And they are already beginning to produce ventilators and masks, and we're shipping them from one place to the other. We're working, as Robert said, on the whole question around logistics. I mean, if you look at Ethiopian Airlines, they have perfected their logistics systems. We still need to work, yes, on the ports. We need to work on other things. But there is now, I think, with trying just to distribute COVID material, and the African Union, Africa CDC, the Economic Commission for Africa, ECONET, and AfriEximbank, we put together this African Medical Supplies Platform, where essentially countries can procure the commodities they need, and then you need to do the distribution. And that is already testing our systems, but we're learning a lot from that. That is going to then help to ensure that we can do better as the CFTA comes into being, because you're right, yes, we can use e-commerce, but someday somebody needs to knock your door and drop that package at your doorstep, as we know, and that whole process needs to be automated and made seamless. And I think a lot of that work is already happening with COVID, and thank God for that, because what we are getting countries to do is actually some of the policies that would have taken maybe a year and a half to take away because we need to rush deliveries into countries. Some of those things are already beginning to be harmonized. So there has been some benefit actually in terms of standing up the African trading system because of COVID, because some of these restrictions are now being lifted globally on the continent.
That's a very interesting. That's a very interesting point. Let me bring in one topic which a number of our participants are raising, and I'd like to hear first from you, Robert, and then Vera, your views as well. Which is the topic of investment, which is probably a critical sort of companion for the success of the CFTA. And we have a comment here from Herman Cohen, a retired US diplomat, who says, will African governments receive advice on improving their investment climate so that African entrepreneurs will invest in production facilities? The World Bank study doing business is not very optimistic on this. Then we also have, in a similar sort of view, or something, a very interesting work that is being shared with us by Anirudh Shingal, who finds that intra-African trade elasticity of greenfield investment to be positive, including for intermediaries, especially in host countries with strong governance indicators. So sort of, again, reaffirming the importance of investment for intra-African trade. We also have a couple of other people, Rigoberto Torres, saying how can be a significant obstacle to Africa the position in the different rankings like doing business and competitiveness index. So again, the importance of improving the investment climate and fostering investment as a way to maximize or leverage the benefits of the CFTA. So Robert, you want to come in first on this one, and then Vera, I'd like to hear your views as well.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and that's why, while this is a period of great pessimism for the global economy, there are structural changes taking place. They were already there prior to the current COVID crisis, and they are ones where Africa, particularly through foreign direct investment, ought to be able to take advantage. And that is that people are questioning the reliance on China as the factory of the world. And the global supply chains are moving. They were already moving because Chinese wage rates were rising to other parts, especially to other parts of Asia, and to some degree back to Mexico and to other parts of Latin America, and to a modest degree to Africa. But this is actually Africa's great opportunity, because creating an investment climate which attracts operators of global supply chains is precisely the way, in my view, in which Africa can integrate itself into global markets, and indeed into the thriving emerging markets. Africa has immense agricultural potential. Agriculture actually is a key ingredient in industrialization. The spillovers from agriculture and enhancing agricultural productivity are very crucial in creating a demand for local manufactured goods. So I think this is an area where Africa has great potential. It hasn't developed the irrigation systems and so on, but hooking into global supply chains for finished agricultural products, and other finished products, obviously, manufactured goods in general, is very vital. And one of your questioners pointed to the still disappointing, although there's some evidence of improvement, cost of doing business indicators. And by the way, improving the regulatory frameworks for foreign investors will automatically improve the regulatory frameworks for domestic investors, because ultimately they want the same systems based on rules of law. And so I think by thinking about what does it take to attract foreign investors, you're going to help yourself and induce more domestic investment, which is ultimately the crucial ingredient for growth. I also want to endorse what Vera said about the idea of competition policy. Mm-hmm. You know, I had a student who was working with me on a policy analysis exercise on transportation within East Africa. And what he found was that they had done a very good job in lowering the amount of time it took to, say, ship products from Mombasa to Kigali. But they found very little decline in the price and the cost of shipping those goods. And so what it reminds you is that, yes, it's necessary to remove the barriers. Yes, it's necessary to have more efficient customs, but ultimately you have to have contestable markets so that firms will drive down prices. And these prices ultimately will be passed through to those who are going to use these improved transportation networks. So I commend those who have set out the program by emphasizing competition policy, and it should be applied in a way that is complementary to the development, especially of infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Robert. Just to say before I give the floor to Vera that we have several comments from Aissatou Diallo, who emphasizes the importance that the CFTA benefits reach the broadest number of people. And I think the point that you're making about competition policy, Robert, goes precisely in that direction. So Vera, your words.
No, thank you. I think three things. First, what is clear is that when Africa trades, and the Economic Commission for Africa, myself, and Anabel, I'm sure you've done some work on this, when Africa trades with itself, Africa creates more value. When Africa creates more value, Africa creates more wealth and reduces more poverty. When Africa creates with the trades with the United States, it creates the second more wealth and the second most value. So essentially, part of the CFTA conversation is also to say, as we trade with the United States, can we attract then foreign direct investment from the United States onto the continent to ensure then that we can produce a lot more of that value? So one of the things we hope as we talk about the CFTA and these regional supply chains is that we want to be able to integrate global supply chains where we see ourselves adding value and attracting that FDI onto the continent to ensure that we can do that. And we're already seeing some of the examples. Again, I use the COVID example. We have firms in Germany that are trying to relocate onto the continent to produce oxygen and ventilators, and we're working with them to see how that can come, because we're already doing some of that. We were already trading with ourselves on some of these materials. And now, European firms are saying, oh, by the way, maybe we can do this. So there is, I think, already clarity in that direction. Of course, it will only happen in places where we have a good business environment. And I beg to differ slightly with Africa not doing well. And, we've been working together on this. Anybody can go and look at the doing business indicators. And over the last, I dare to say, maybe even 10 years, there have always been at least 5 African countries in the top 10. So there has been a consistent, deliberate, resolute effort on the African continent to improve the rankings of the doing business. And we can name from the smallest, countries, Mauritania, Niger, to the larger ones, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, that, are really actively working to improve the doing business. And I think this is one of those conversations we have to have, honestly, is, there is always this sort of, oh, but Africa is not doing well. But if you start looking, there actually is a lot of effort in the doing business indicators. Rwanda consistently in the top 10 of the doing business, and we can see the results. Volkswagen is there, and Mara Phones, an African company that produces phones, is locating there. So my sense is maybe also in this kinds of forums, we need to collectively begin to ensure not that we're changing the narrative, but that we're reporting the actuality of what these documents are showing. And this is the beautiful thing. I'm a believer in the doing business, because I think, you can actually see countries progressing closer to the frontier and doing a lot better. Do we still have a lot more to do? Of course, yes. There is a lot more to do. And of course, as we do more, the environment changes. We fix the roads, and then you need to lay down the internet cables and ensure that that works. But I think there is a resolute effort. We also need our counterparts on the other side to work with us on some of the issues around doing business, because it's a collective effort in terms of ensuring that we have regulation. And I want to come back to this whole issue of investment. A lot of the discussion around investment policy on the continent has been, give the lowest taxes, actually write off any taxes and they will come. I think we now know that that is not true. We know that if you provide the right energy and you give the right infrastructure, roads and transport, then you are much better off, and you actually have some savings that can then ensure that you can then build the logistics frameworks that we need. And there again, I think we do need to have an honest conversation about how much incentives we need to give to foreign companies that come onto the continent. And if that's the case, then maybe we should not be giving those many incentives. And I think that's why the next chapter on investment, on incentives, and on competition policy would be very important for the continent, because what we have ended up seeing is that we compete each other out of the market as we try to give all these incentives and don't work around global regional supply chains. And my sense is as we do that, we will be doing a lot better for ourselves. And then we go back to the WTO conversation of standardization of some of the regulation. We are seeing now in Europe, a lot of the competition moving to sort of phytosanitary and quality, and they become a little bit more subjective considerations, particularly in the agricultural sector. Robert is saying we should focus on that, but Ghana does a lot of it. And one morning, you say you have aflatoxin, none of your maize or none of your this can come into Europe, and we're in trouble. And I think we do need to ensure that some of these systems are standardized, and there's a process for doing that ensures that Africa can remain competitive in the global space.
I think you're both making a great point in terms of the importance of foreign direct investment for Africa, and getting the fundamentals right to make sure that investment can come. And I think, Vera, you mentioned the point, and I remember when working at the bank, we worked very closely with Rwanda, with Kenya, with Ghana, with Nigeria, with a number of countries
Senegal,
in the region, actually. Yeah, Senegal, clearly, to improve the business climate. And many interesting stories coming out of Africa. I would agree with that. Still need to work on energy, of course, transportation, logistics. And I think these are all important issues. Now, we have a good friend of mine, Joy Katekewa from UNCTAD, speaks about the importance of building productive capacity in Africa, which is a bit what we have been discussing here, precisely with the importance of regional value chains and how COVID is actually, in a way, sort of spearheading some of these initiatives. So I'd like the two of you to comment a little bit about the importance of building productive capacity in the region. And I also would like to put this together with another question that we have from one of our colleagues at the Peterson Institute, Colin Hendricks, who's also a professor at the University of Denver, and someone who's very, very knowledgeable on the region. And he says, excluding Southern Africa, levels of intra-African agricultural trade are comparatively low. Are there significant prospects for increasing intra-regional food and agricultural trade? We know that ag is a difficult issue in trade negotiations. And I would like to add here that I do think that greater intra-regional trade is very important for food security in Africa. So let me hear your views, Vera, on this issue of productive capacity in general, and then more about agricultural trade. And then I'll come to you. And I think this will probably be our last question because we're getting closer to the hour. So you still have a few minutes to go into this, please. Vera?
Thank you. I want to leave the audience with a couple of numbers. So Africa's trade in the global community was 2% 2 decades ago. We are still at 2%, despite having joined the WTO, despite having more countries that appear to be trading outside the continent more. And that brings us to the question of why. And why we have not developed the productive capacity to transform our goods from raw commodities into more value addition resources. And I think that's where we begin to talk about the enabling environment, the energy that we need, the roads that we need, the ports. But today, Africa is one of the continents that's building the most ports. We are one of the continents that is standing up the most roads. I think, as Robert said, more public-private partnerships. I think the number of IPPs in the energy sector that Africa has closed in the last 6 years is probably 4 times what we have done in the 20 years before. which means essentially attracting a lot more private sector investment onto the continent. And I mean, you look at Morocco, they have the largest solar facility that they've put up, the huge IPPs. Egypt is doing the same. But there is a second issue in terms of productive capacity. Today, Egypt produces an incredible amount of pharmaceutical products, but they cannot sell them on the continent because of this border issues. And so that is why we're doing things like the CFTA, so that even those who have the right productive capacity can actually then ensure that the goods are tradable on the continent. So it's not just the production of it or getting the productive capacity. It has to be this comprehensive program that we're putting together. And we hope that that will happen as we go forward. The second thing, Africa's total sort of resources or revenue from trade is 500 billion. That is more than we get from FDI. That's more than we get from FDI, ODA, and all the others combined. So if we want to continue to grow the continent, to improve on poverty, our measures of poverty reduction and achieving the SDGs, we must continue to bet on trade, because we believe that that is our route out of a situation where we have still more poor people on the continent. But how do we do that? We must do that with some resolute agreement that we're going to improve our policy systems. We need clarity, governance. I think the transparency of the systems, both for African producers, but also for our partners that come into the continent, is particularly important. And the CFTA, we hope, also provides us with some blueprint for better transparency. When you have certainty, when you have standardization, then businesses, whether you're investing in Kenya or you're investing in Ivory Coast, you know that you are in front of the same regulatory framework, the same standard, the same processes that should make you work. So I think these three things are what our leaders and the continent is betting on: is the transparency, the improvements in trade, so that we can deliver better for our particularly SMEs, because that is really where value addition happens and supply chains become better. It's small little businesses that form a collective. And we hope that Africa is making the right bet on that.
Thank you very much, Vera, for your excellent reflections now at the end. Robert, let me now turn it over to you, please.
Well, I think Vera has made excellent points about capacity and the need, obviously, for productive capacity. I think, obviously, complementary to that is the need for enhancing education and skills, because what we know is that what attracts particularly the kinds of investors that you'd like to see coming to your country is a skilled workforce. And some of the countries, Africa is very diverse, some of the countries leave much to be desired in their educational performance and the skills that are being given to the workers in the form of both formal education and on-the-job training. And this is very, very critical. Actually, it's a reason why foreign direct investment can be very important in transmitting some of those skills and capabilities. But in addition, I think the local educational systems really have to be a point of emphasis, and I think everyone knows that, in order to be the vital complement if trade is ultimately going to flourish. I also have a somewhat heretical idea, and that is there's a tendency within Africa to think linearly when it comes to value addition. Because you have the raw materials, in some cases, yes, it makes sense to develop finished products, more sophisticated products that use those raw materials. If you grow coffee, you know, coffee today comes in a lot of different varieties, and you can get much more value if you can specialize in those kinds of coffees, you know, that we buy at Starbucks for exorbitant prices. But there are other kinds of raw materials where you are not necessarily going to have advantage. Just because you have diamonds, for instance, in the ground, doesn't mean to say you automatically know how to cut diamonds or trade diamonds, or that you'll be excellent in doing that. Just because you can make sneakers doesn't mean to say you can sell them. You know how to market them. So that's the whole purpose of global value chains. And then sometimes it isn't necessarily because you have the raw materials. So I don't want to detract from the proposition that Africa needs the capacity to add value. Obviously, that's the way you become wealthier. But I do just want to provoke the audience into thinking non-linearly, not vertically, simply because you have the raw materials, simply because you have bauxite, for instance, it doesn't mean to say you necessarily should make finished aluminum, which requires a lot of energy. So you need to differentiate. You need to allow the market and your own planners and policymakers to sort out where your comparative advantages are going to lie. And they won't necessarily lie in areas where you simply have the raw material. They'll lie in areas in which you have the skills, the know-how, and indeed can fit into global supply chains where others might be able to bring more complementary assets to the table.
Thank you very much, really, to both of you, Dr. Vera Songwe, Dr. Robert Lawrence, for what I thought was a very inspiring, provocative conversation. And I think our audience thought so, because we had 47 questions, which I will send to both of you because they are very interesting material for reflection. So I think that we are going to need to bring you back to answer some of those questions. So again, Vera, Robert, thank you very much. Thanks a lot to our audience. Please keep coming back and keep engaging. I would also like to thank my colleagues at the Peterson Institute for making Trade Winds possible. And please stay tuned for our next episode of Trade Winds, which will take place on Wednesday, August 19th. Until then, thank you all very much and goodbye.